Hello, USD 435. In an effort to continue to keep you all informed on the latest information, we're going to share today about the changes to FERPA in regards to your students' privacy. We will be going over what FERPA is, what is considered an education record, what FERPA looks like in your classroom, resources for how to make sure you are following FERPA guidelines, FERPA and immigration, as well as your school resource officer, FERPA and digital data, security, as well as what are some typical hazards that we must be aware of to avoid. So, what is FERPA? FERPA stands for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. The law provides the right of parents and adult age students to inspect and receive a copy of student records. It also gives them the right to deny access to others, specifically those that are outside of our school system, of course, with some exceptions. It has a process to correct errors, including a hearing if needed. It also includes the right to opt out of military recruitment, the right to opt out of the disclosure of a student's directory information, and it also includes a complaint process, which we will talk about a little bit later, that is handled by the Family Compliance Office of the U.S. Department of Education. FERPA does have some significant shortcomings. It does not give individuals the right to sue the school. Only the U.S. Department of Education can sanction schools that have violated FERPA. It puts burden on students and parents to respond to an opt-out opportunity to disclose directory information, and it does not dictate requirements for safeguarding education records. So, what are education records as recognized by FERPA? Under FERPA, education records consist of anything directly related to a student that is maintained by an educational agency or institution. So, that could be the student's name and address of parents and family members, personal identifiers such as your social security number or the numbers of your student number as designated through government, your personal characteristics that identify a student's birthplace, mother's maiden name, family and economic information. The following are not considered education records, and that would be records of teachers and administrators that are kept in their sole possession. So it's not records that are not shared with anybody else, but considered as your teacher notes that you keep to reflect on would not be considered part of their educational record. Once you share them, they do become a part of that record. Records of a law enforcement unit of the educational institution, any medical or psychological records of a student who is at least 18 years of age or attending a post-secondary institution, when those records are maintained by a healthcare professional. And then personal records of those individuals employed by the education institution. And those all came from the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse 2015. So looking at FERPA in the classroom and the impact that you have as teachers and what you need to be thinking about when you are working with students and with student files and within your classroom. You need to make sure you're very careful with technology use in your lessons, as we know that data hacking and identity hacking happens a lot nowadays. So make sure that you're not using websites that require your students to enter personal information unless it has been approved by the school or your school's technology officer. You need to make sure that you keep any student data that you have secure. So that would be storing it in a safe place, not leaving it out for other people to see, making sure that you're not accidentally disclosing student information to the wrong people. Also, you don't want to use websites that, when responding to an access request, be sure that you know your student's legal guardians. Under FERPA, parent includes a natural parent, a guardian, or an individual acting as a parent in the absence of a parent. And just to caution you that making sure that when you do receive a phone call or an email, that you are familiar enough with that parent to know that, yes, it is truly them you're talking to, or yes, it is truly the email that you correspond with the parent that's listed within their records to be able to communicate with them. So this is a department, U.S. Department of Education FERPA resource that was created just to give schools more clarification in understanding FERPA and the rights of students and families in an effort to clarify the school and district's responsibilities as it relates to student information. The new resource explains that general FERPA requirements, the type of information protected by the student privacy law, and exceptions to FERPA's written consent mandate. And that comes from enforcement in 2019. In the context of school safety, FERPA makes an exception to its restrictions on data sharing should knowledge of such information be necessary to protect the health or safety of students or other persons in connection with an emergency. So just a little bit more clarification on when you can share information. If there is a medical or health emergency, you definitely are going to share that information, even though it's not a typical person who has access to those student records. In FERPA is an area where widespread confusion still remains, unfortunately, and this clarification that the U.S. Department of Education created will hopefully give our local school leaders and law enforcement tools that they need to protect student privacy, but also ensuring that health and safety of those students. So it is a nice little resource that we can access as a district to help give us further guidance when it comes to FERPA. Something to remember within working with students in FERPA, if there is a complaint by a parent or students, and they believe that their rights under FERPA have been violated, they may file a formal complaint with the Department of Education, and then that department will continue to conduct a full formal investigation where necessary and appropriate to enforce rights and resolve violations under the statute and regulations. It is important to note that if the department does find an educational agency or institution has violated FERPA, the department will work with the educational agency or institution to bring it into compliance. And typically, this will not affect your funding from the federal government unless that agency or institution refuses to cooperate. Thus, then your funding could definitely be affected because you are refusing to be compliant. So looking a little bit more closely at how FERPA relates to how our school resource officers work with our students and have access to student files. Under FERPA, school districts may consider law enforcement unit officials such as off-duty police officers and SROs to be school officials if the school or district has outsourced the function of providing safety and security for the school or district to the law enforcement unit officials. We know that here at Abilene School, we do have a school resource officer that has been outsourced with our local police department, and so therefore he would the FERPA recommendation laws would include him within under these jurisdictions. So law enforcement unit officials could qualify as school officials under FERPA if they perform an institutional service or function for which the school or district would otherwise use employees to ensure school safety. To meet that criteria specified in the school or district's annual notification of FERPA rights for being school officials with a legitimate educational interest, and that they are under the direct control of the school or district with respect to the use and maintenance of those education records. And that is from the U.S. Department of Education in 2019. Looking a little more closely, thinking of how our school resource officers interact with students, as well as students that are immigrants or are not here for, or are here possibly through an outside program of foreign exchange or things like that. Of student enrollment practices that may chill or discourage the participation or lead to the exclusion of students based on their or their parents' or guardians' actual or perceived citizenship or immigration status, contravene federal law. And that's from the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. So what is our school resource officer's role in removing those undocumented students? SROs generally have no role in the removal of those undocumented students, and schools are considered what they call a sensitive location in which ICE officers and agents are to refrain from enforcement actions unless, again, coming back to that extraordinary circumstances of there's a risk to public safety, health, or emergency situations. Further, under the FERPA, school districts must maintain the confidentiality of all personally identifiable information and education records related to students. FERPA permits school districts to disclose student information if there is a judicial order or lawfully issued subpoena. Again, if there's a health or safety emergency, or in connection with a student engaged in a crime of violence or a sex offense. Those would be some outside situations that FERPA will permit the disclosure of that information. There is no general exemption to FERPA that grants ICE agents unfettered access to student information, and that comes from the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates as well. Looking at FERPA and digital data, as of September 2019, at least 10 school districts have been in the news for their own ransomware attacks, and the U.S. Department of Education reports that hundreds of educational data breaches occur annually, and that's from Cunningham 2019. We know that as we continue to grow in the area of technology and the use of more apps and programs that are online, we are opening ourselves up to more ransomware attacks as well as identity thefts and things like that. So we must be aware of this and make sure that we are looking at ways to help make sure that we can protect our students within our district. So thinking of that, being aware of classroom assignments and assessments that are delivered online via laptops or tablets. We need to make sure that we're careful with websites that may say that they're free apps in class, because a lot of those apps or websites, while look as to be beneficial, they actually can outsource that information to other people and thus giving away your student information to them. With an increase in digital record keeping and technology in the classroom, FERPA needs to be re-examined to address concerns such as identity theft and fraud to better protect students. There have been some revisements to FERPA over the years, but they have been by individual states, thus making it hard to follow all the different changes because not every state has accepted those revisements. Schools in an educational agency are responsible for the data of their students, and no one should have access to that besides parents, students, and third-party service providers. The understanding is that laws and regulations also apply to those providers to protect that data as if they were the school, and that's from Cunningham 2019. One other concern compounding the problem is that FERPA has been weakened numerous times over the years through those regulatory changes that I mentioned above, which has made it easier for schools to collect and share this data with large private corporations, including Silicon Valley giants such as Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, as well as thousands of smaller ed tech companies, many of them startups, who, again, like I said, it looks like a good deal. They'll offer their wares for free to schools, but the problem with that is in exchange, they're getting that student data. Moving on to looking at schools and security cameras in FERPA. So surveillance cameras are being used more frequently because of the increase in school violence and the ability to monitor students throughout the building. Currently, all buildings in Abilene have security cameras, and more than 80% of schools in the United States use cameras. It is important that we understand the privacy laws surrounding our students. There are some guiding legal principles that fall under those. One being the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits governmental entities such as public schools from conducting unreasonable searches. Schools are allowed legal surveillance in low privacy expectation areas such as hallways, cafeterias, buses, and stairwells, but in those higher privacy areas, it is not something you should not be placing security cameras in those areas. The Electronic Communication Privacy Act and statewide wiretapping laws of 1986 prohibits the intentional interception of any oral communication except where one party to the conversation has consented to the recording. It's recommended that schools are careful when considering audio surveillance and make sure that you're consulting with legal counsel before implementing those things. FERPA requires schools receiving federal funding to preserve the confidentiality of student education records and the personally identifiable information, which could include images of students captured on surveillance recordings, qualify as educational records when the photo or video is directly related to a student and maintained by an educational institution. And finally, the Open Records Law. All states have adopted laws providing individuals access to public records. School surveillance recordings are often the subject of public records requests by the media, citizen groups, or other third parties. So with that in mind, I thought it was important to go ahead and include some guidance for our schools. This came from Fox and Solomon 2019. We need to make sure that schools, that we are developing and publishing policies describing the purpose of surveillance cameras and the parameters for use. Making sure that we're installing cameras only in areas where individuals have low expectation of privacy, notifying the school community of the use of surveillance cameras via policies, handbooks, websites, newsletters, consulting with a legal counsel prior to enabling audio recording, establishing protocols for maintaining equipment and retaining recordings and apply them consistently. Consulting the Family Policy Compliance Office on photos and videos under FERPA, and when evaluating requests for access from parents, law enforcement, and media and other third parties. Again, just making sure that we are following those rights and those responsibilities under FERPA. And then developing protocols governing requests for disclosure, including the handling of requests for copies. Making sure that we are FERPA compliant in Abilene public schools. We, as a district, need to make sure we are educating all employees on FERPA, that employees understand rights and limits for viewing and sharing records, that if we are using third-party vendors, that we make sure that they comply with FERPA as well. It's important that we provide yearly training on FERPA, implement and follow FERPA policies and procedures, encrypt files and emails that we are sending with student data in them, consistently monitor usage and evaluate for breaches so that we, again, are protecting our students. And then finally, making sure that FERPA is followed by our public schools, because we don't want to take the chance of missing out on funding because we are not following those expectations. So looking a little more at FERPA and data and how we appropriately can get rid of that data that we are no longer needing. There's 3 ways you can clear, purge, and destroy. FERPA does not provide any specific requirements for educational agencies and institutions regarding the disposition or destruction of the data that they collect and maintain themselves. Other than requiring them to safeguard FERPA, protected data from unauthorized disclosure, and not to destroy any education records if there is an outstanding request to inspect or review them. And that came from Privacy Technical Assistance Center 2014. So basically, we want to make sure also that we're minimizing the amount of data that you retain by destroying them when they're no longer needed. That is a key element of the Fair Information Practice Principles and is widely considered to be a best practice for protecting individual privacy and for lessening the potential impact of a data breach. Make sure that as you are looking to destroy data, that you are talking to your IT professional within your district to ensure proper deletion of records consistent with technology best practice standards. We want to make sure that we're avoiding using just a file deletion or a disk formatting or one-way encryption to dispose of sensitive data, because these methods are not effective and they leave the majority of the data intact, which is going to make it more vulnerable to being retrieved or getting into the wrong hands of people who we don't want to have it. So, when we are thinking about FERPA and possible hazards or common hazards that we just need to be aware of as a school district here at USD 435, bottom line, assume that all information directly related to a student is part of that student's education record and therefore cannot be disclosed without written consent. Other key points: be careful of vendors, even though it looks like a good thing that you're getting some freebies and you're going to be able to use them in your classroom and help those students. In actuality, we don't know what type of student data those vendors are taking, and we don't know that they're following those FERPA standards unless we have a written and signed contract with them. So we need to make sure that we are aware of that. Be careful when eliminating records. If you're wanting to get rid of records, they definitely must be shredded before we're placing them in the garbage. Um, know when to release and withhold those records. Again, it's a violation to deny the student access to his own records if they are at least 18 or are enrolled in a post-secondary education. And be careful with whom and where you share information. An inappropriate disclosure to just one person and an inappropriate disclosure to thousands of people on social media are both FERPA violations. It's easier to disclose to 1,000 people, definitely in the social media age that we are in right now. So something to be very aware of within your dealings as an educator. And that includes thinking about how, even if you're sharing things that are happening in your classroom that might be identifiable to, might have identifiable student information within them. So here are our current USD 435 student data policies. IDAE student privacy policy. The superintendent, the board, and staff shall protect the right of privacy of students and their families in connection with any surveys or physical examinations conducted, assisted, or authorized by the board or administration. The district shall annually provide parents notice of their rights under the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment and the Student Data Privacy Act at the beginning of each school year and at any other time the school district policies in the area are substantially changed. Student data restrictions. Any student data submitted to and maintained by a statewide longitudinal student data system shall only be disclosed in accordance with the Student Data Privacy Act. The disclosure of all other student data or student record information maintained is governed by the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Annual written notice presented to parents and legal guardians of district students shall require a parent or guardian signature and shall state student data submitted to and maintained by a statewide longitudinal data system. And that is just a snapshot of some of our student data policies. There are more policies added to this within our board policies. Thank you for listening today. I hope that you have a better understanding of FERPA as it relates to you and your classroom, as well as maintaining the privacy of your students and their rights. These are the resources I use to present this information to you. And I hope that you have a great day. Thank you.